Broadcasting to you now from a dingy garage turned studio in beautiful northern Colorado, this is Freelance Filmmaker, and I am your co-host, Jeremiah.
And I'm Gwyneth.
And we are here to help you on your journey to become freelance creatives. We are a corporate filmmaking and fine arts photography firm, and we are here to share our experiences, our knowledge, and our lessons learned with you so you have a better chance of succeeding and realizing your dreams in the film world. Our goal is to build a network of creatives and individuals and professionals who are willing to work together, rely on each other, learn from one another, and ultimately make this journey a wonderful one. And welcome back to another week of Freelance Filmmaker. We're really excited because we got a great episode planned for you this week. But before we roll into it, again, let's have a word from our sponsors. I'm just kidding, I won't make you wait. First, we're going to be rolling into the photography class run by Gwyneth, and she's going to be covering Aperture and how it affects your image, depth of field, all that fun stuff. Those fun terms that you keep hearing but you didn't quite understand up until today. Then I will be covering in my filmmaking class the basics of sensors, sensor sizing, and how it affects your camera and the way it interacts with your lenses. And then we've got a wonderful business class where we're going to cover the basics of building an effective business timeline. So how to set goals, how to make sure that you're progressing your business at the speed that you want to, and the tools that you need to do so effectively. Then we've got an amazing interview planned with a really incredible individual, Lindsay Jackson. She actually got selected for the American Film Institute. She was one of like 7,000 applicants, and I think only 24 or 25 actually made it in. So she's an incredibly talented cinematographer, and she's going to drop some of her tips and tricks on you. And maybe one of you will go to the American Film Institute one day. And then Gwyneth will be taking it off with a review on the Sony 24 to 70 millimeter lens. This is one of our favorite lenses, super versatile, so she can tell you all about it, what she likes, what she doesn't like. I'll give you a hint, price. And then we'll roll into a resource recommendation, and we've got a really special one for you this week. Last week's episode was super long, so we're going to keep it a little bit shorter this week, so you folks aren't falling asleep behind your computer screens. All right, let's roll right into it.
All right, you freelance filmmaker nerds. In today's photography class, we are going to talk about aperture. Put simply, aperture is the opening in the lens through which light travels to strike the sensor in the camera. This opening in the camera lens is called an iris diaphragm. Aperture is measured in f-stops that usually range between 1.2 and 32. The iris diaphragm of a camera lens is made up of overlapping blades. To give you a perspective, let's think of the iris diaphragm much like the pupil of the human eye. The smaller the pupil of the human eye, the less light that is let in. The bigger the pupil, the more light enters the eye. By this logic, aperture, first and foremost, affects exposure. So far in our classes, we have learned that there is an exposure triangle made up of ISO, shutter speed, and aperture. All three of these things affect the brightness of your final image. In order to ensure that our image or scene is properly exposed with the right aperture, we need to quantify the iris diaphragm size. So aperture can be referred to as f-stop, f-number, focal ratio, or f-ratio. This being said, aperture is most commonly referred to as f-stop. There is another term used to describe lenses, and that's fast or slow. A fast lens is a lens that is capable of extremely low f-stops. For example, f-stop 0.95. An example of a slow lens would be a lens with a minimum f-stop of 3.5. Alright, let's now talk about actual f-stops. F-stops usually range between 1.2 and 32. So if you have a lower f-stop number, such as 1.4 or 1.8, that means your iris diaphragm will be a lot more open, which allows a lot more light to come into that sensor. But if you have a higher f-stop number, such as 32, your iris diaphragm will be a lot smaller and allow less light in. So when you move from a higher f-stop number, such as 32, to a lower f-stop number, such as 1.4, is called stopping down. When you move from a lower f-stop number to a higher f-stop number, that's called stopping up. When you move from one f-stop number to the next, you are either doubling or halving the light that's coming in through the lens to the sensor. Alright, we've discussed how aperture affects exposure. Let's talk about how it affects depth of field. Okay, so depth of field is one of the most important tools to both photographers as well as cinematographers in order to create dynamic and striking imagery. So let's define what depth of field actually is. Depth of field is defined as the distance between the nearest and farthest areas in an image or scene that appear acceptably sharp. The area in your depth of field that is most in focus is called your point of focus. So depth of field can be influenced by a number of things, such as your camera sensor size, your focal length, or the distance between you and your subject. But one of the most important factors is aperture. Okay, let's look at how f-stop numbers affect depth of field. When you have a lower f-stop number, such as 1.4, you are going to have a much shallower depth of field than if you have a higher f-stop number, such as 32. Alright, let's review how aperture, exposure, and depth of field interact. So the lower your f-stop number, the wider your iris diaphragm will be, which will allow more light to come in, but that makes for a much shallower depth of field. The higher your f-stop number, the smaller your iris diaphragm will be, which will allow less light to come into the sensor and makes for a much wider depth of field. Alright, let's look at apertures in use. Why would you use a lower aperture versus a higher aperture? Of course, the aperture you use is very dependent on your personal taste and the scenario in which you're using it. But in photography, lower apertures are usually used for things like portraiture, where you want to separate your subject from your background, whereas higher apertures are necessary for landscape photography, where you want your entire scene in focus. This being said, the way you use aperture is very much light dependent. So if you are photographing or filming during the day, you're probably going to be forced to use a much higher aperture. But if you're photographing or filming during the night, you're going to be forced to use a lower aperture. There are ways to offset this issue, but we'll cover that in depth in future episodes. Okay, if you aren't already confused, let's talk about f-stops versus t-stops. The main difference between f-stops and t-stops is that the f-stop is a measurement of the iris diaphragm, whereas the t-stop is a measurement of the light that actually hits the sensor. F-stops are primarily used on photography lenses, whereas t-stops are primarily used on cinema lenses. So why is there a difference between an f-stop and a t-stop? So as light comes into the lens, not all of it reaches the sensor. Some of it is reflected backwards or absorbed by the lens. So lens quality and glass clarity play a huge factor in how much light actually reaches the sensor. So the t-stop actually accounts for that, so it's a much more accurate representation of how much light is actually hitting the sensor of your camera. Alright, you nerds, that wraps up for this week's photography class. I'll pass it on to Jeremiah for his filmmaking class.
Alright, so for today's filmmaking class, we've already talked about how your sensor detects light. Well, now we're going to talk about sensor sizing and how it affects you. Now, I know there are all those guys with the micro 4/3 sensors running around telling you that size doesn't matter. Well, I'm here to tell you, size matters. So we'll roll right on into it. You've heard phrases like full frame sensor, aps-c, micro 4/3, things of that nature. Well, now we're going to demystify it for you today. The first thing to consider when buying a new camera is the size of the sensor. A great example for comparing sensor size would be the iPhone versus our A7S II. Both cameras have the capability to shoot in 4K, but our Sony A7S II has a full frame sensor, so that's 36 millimeters by 24 millimeters, and the iPhone has a sensor that is 5.16 millimeters by 6.25 millimeters. You'll notice right off the bat, the image from the Sony looks significantly better. Remember, the larger the sensor, the better the image quality. As with ISO, sensor size is somewhat tied to film stock formats. A full-frame sensor is the same size as 35mm photography film stock, which had at one point been the most popular film stock in the world. This means that a full-frame sensor has the same amount of surface area exposed as 35mm photography film stock. This sizing of film stock is not to be confused with focal length. Focal length refers to lens construction. Both just happen to be measured in millimeters, so that's why it's a little confusing. So the first up is the full-frame sensor. Now, a full-frame sensor has a crop factor of 1, and I'll explain what that means in a few minutes. Next up, we have the aps-c sensor. Now, aps-c isn't exactly standardized, and there may be some variation from brand to brand. Full frame, when compared to aps-c, has 2.5 times more surface area with which to catch the light. Again, because there is a little bit of variation, the average consensus for the aps-c sensor is a crop factor of 1.62. Here we have the micro four thirds sensor. Full frame, when compared to a micro four thirds sensor, has 3.8 times more surface area with which to catch the light. The crop factor for a micro four thirds sensor is a factor of 2. So we already know that a larger sensor produces a better image. Now it's time to look at how they interact with different lenses. So lenses are circular, and a circular lens produces a circular image. Because the sensor is square, everything that falls outside of that sensor area is not recorded. So this is the image that the sensor captures. Now let's say this is an image of a full frame lens on a full frame sensor camera. And yes, there are different lens types for different sensor types. This circle is the whole image that the lens projects. This, again, is the amount that gets recorded. Only the light that hits the sensor gets captured. Now over here is an aps-c sensor coupled with an aps-c lens. You'll get the same exact result because that cropped lens has scaled the light proportionally to match that cropped sensor. And same again with the micro four thirds sensor and lens. So you can see it's very important that if you have an aps-c sensor that you're getting matching aps-c lenses. Same with full frame, same with micro four thirds. That leads us to the next step, purchasing lenses to match your sensor. Let's say you have a Canon aps-c camera. A lens for this camera may have a name like this: Canon EFS mount 50mm f-stop 1.4 for Canon aps-c. Now I can see some of you starting to have heart palpitations behind your screen. For the purposes of this episode, we are only going to focus on the last part, but I'm going to explain that whole title just so you have an idea of what it is that you're looking at. So the first part, Canon. That is just the manufacturer of the lens. Of course, there are others, Nikon, Sony, Sigma, etc. That second part, EFS mount. Now that is a description of the coupling mechanism that actually hooks the lens to your camera. So if you have an E-mount lens and an EF mount camera, say a Canon, they're not going to couple. So you need to make sure that your lens mount and your camera mount match. The mount is the ring around the sensor where the lens connects to the camera body. Canon have their prominent EF mounts, Sony uses E mounts. There are tons and tons of different mount types. So again, just make sure they match. Otherwise, square peg, round hole. Of course, there are adapters, but that is a whole different can of worms that we'll cover later on down the road. Now, back to that description. The 50mm portion refers to the focal length of the lens. The lower the focal length, the wider your field of view. Think about it like this. If you've ever seen a GoPro video, it captures everything in front of it. Now compare that to looking through a telescope. When looking through a telescope, you can't see everything around you, but what you can see appears much closer to you. So a lens with a 400mm focal length would be more akin to that telescope, whereas a 16mm lens would be more akin to that GoPro. Now that 1.4 f-stop refers to how wide you can get your aperture and how much light you can actually let into your camera. Now the last part is the important part for this episode, and that's the part we're going to cover. For Canon aps-c. That means it's built for a Canon camera with an aps-c sensor. If you have a full frame camera, you'll want to purchase lenses labeled as full frame lenses. Now, that's not to say that you can't use an aps-c camera with a full frame lens. Now, remember those crop factor numbers I gave you earlier? Of course you do. You're a studious bunch, but just in case, here's the graphic to remind you. So again, a full frame sensor has a crop factor of 1, an aps-c sensor has a crop factor of 1.62, and a micro four thirds sensor has a crop factor of 2. Now let's take a full frame 100mm lens, just to keep the numbers nice and even, and put it on an aps-c camera, again with a crop factor of 1.62. Now this is the fun part for all you nerds out there like us. Math! As you can see in this graphic, that aps-c sensor is catching a much smaller portion of the image being projected into the camera. It has changed the look of the lens. This no longer looks like the image of a 100mm lens, which is this. It now looks like this because it cropped in. So take the focal length of the lens, 100mm, and multiply it by 1.62, the crop factor for the aps-c sensor, and you get 162. That is the focal length of a full frame 100mm lens on an aps-c sensor. Now, as Gwyneth discussed in her class, that aperture or f-stop determines 2 different things: light let into the camera and depth of field. Because light intensity does not change with a smaller sensor, that does not affect brightness of the image, but it does change relative depth of field. So if you are at an f-stop of 5.6, you are at a depth of field more akin to a 9.07. You're using the same process to get this number, by the way. So, aperture you're using times the crop factor, in this case 1.62, equals your true depth of field. So again, if my full frame lens is set to an f-stop of 5.6, and now I'm going to change it up, and it's attached to my micro four thirds sensor, I am going to get the same amount of light as an f-stop of 5.6, but my depth of field will actually be closer to an 11.2. So 5.6 times 2, because again, crop factor on a micro four thirds sensor is 2. Now, if you want a more in-depth explanation of why the depth of field changes with that crop factor, I will include a link to a resource in the show notes. I am simply not smart enough to explain to you the physics behind that. I will also include a cool little link to a website that helps you calculate depth of field and focal length when using a full frame lens on a cropped sensor. So I know this question is coming, so here it goes. Yes, you can use a cropped sensor lens on a full frame camera. So in this image, you see an aps-c cropped lens projected onto a full frame sensor. Notice how the projection does not cover the entirety of the sensor? Those areas not covered would appear as dark or black and create heavy vignetting on your image, like this. So to put things into perspective, here's a nice little graphic showing that breakdown of sensor size, crop factor, and cameras that fall into each category. So that wraps it up for this week's filmmaking class. We will see all you nerds back here next week for some more filmmaking knowledge. So in this week's business class, we're going to be covering building an effective business timeline. After last week, you know what you need to make to survive, you know what your operational costs are, you know what you need to charge, so now's the next step. I touched on it a little last week, but building a business timeline is super important. It gives you an idea of what you need to achieve and in what order, and all of the subtasks that you need to achieve in order to hit each of your big milestones. Before you get too focused on your goal, take inventory of where you are. Every great journey has a starting point, and if you don't know what yours is, it's time to find out. Here are a few things to consider. First, are you currently working? Second, what skills and knowledge do you already have? Third, what equipment and tools do you already have? Fourth, do you have startup capital? There are a plethora of other things to consider when figuring out where it is that you are, but those are the big ones. Once you know where it is that you are, it's time to think about where you want to be. 1 month from now, 6 months from now, a year from now, 3 years from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now. Once you have an idea of where it is you want to be and when, you can start setting milestones. It's time to start plugging subtasks into your timeline. A lot of these subtasks are things that are going to have to occur even before you can open your doors for business. First, research equipment and build a wish list. We will cover this in more depth later, but it's important to consider all your needs when building this wish list. Once you've built that wish list, it's time to consider what equipment you need before you can actually open your doors for business. After that, take that remaining equipment and build a timeline for when you want to purchase that equipment. Let's say, for example, you want to start filming weddings, but you don't have money at the time of your startup to purchase a gimbal or a stabilizer. And you know that you want to start filming weddings in 6 months. That gives you a 6-month timeline to put aside the money that you need to purchase a Steadicam or a gimbal. Make sure you've got your website completed. You can use Wix, Squarespace, WordPress, any of those. And once your website is completed and up to your satisfaction, you don't have to publish it immediately, but make sure it's ready to go by the time that you're ready to open your doors for business. Then, set up a company email. This one's important. Make it look legitimate. johndoephotography@gmail.com does not look nearly as professional as contact@johndoephotography.com. Have all of your forms built. So this includes contracts, checklists, print releases, all of that legal paperwork. So the moment that you open your doors and you get clients, you're able to hand them the paperwork that you need to give them in order to do business legitimately and hold yourself and your clients accountable. Prep your Facebook page, your Instagram page, your Vimeo, your YouTube, your LinkedIn, have them all ready to go. And again, if you're not quite ready to open your doors for business, you can make them private. But that way, when you do open your doors, you can make them public all at the same time and in one big burst, reveal your business to the world. Figure out what it is that you need to learn or understand to hit your 1-month goal, 6-month goal, 1-year goal, etc. Let's say, for example, you're a great photographer, but your editing skills are not up to par. Maybe you're unorganized. Maybe you're just not as efficient as you could be. Maybe your skills just aren't quite where they need to be to edit your photos to perfection. That should be at the top of your list. Research, build a list, and plan out the classes and courses that you want to take. Build your deliverables process from top to bottom. So, if you're a photographer, how are you providing your proofs to your clients? Are you using something like Dropbox, or are you using a proofing service such as Pixieset? How are you going to provide your prints to clients? Are you going to use a local printer, or are you going to use the services provided to you by your proofing service? If you're a filmmaker, how are you providing your previews to your clients? Are you using watermarked videos, or are you using a Collaborate.tv account? All of these things are things that you need to have in place before you can open your doors for business. If you don't have a plan for it, then you're going to run into a wall when it comes time to provide everything to your clients effectively. Plan out how you're going to manage your business financially. Are you going to use QuickBooks? Are you going to manage it all through a business bank account? How are you going to handle your invoicing? What will your invoices look like? How can your clients pay? Will you only take cash and check? Will you take cards? If so, how are you going to process those credit card payments? All of these things, again, are things you need to consider when looking at the financial aspects of your business. And one of the last steps before opening your doors, purchase that first set of equipment. Again, you're going to want to consider what equipment you need to operate effectively, and you've got to figure out how you're going to pay for it. Have you put away money to pay for that equipment, or are you taking out a business loan? If you're taking out a business loan, you've got to consider that you've got to be drawing in enough clients to make sure that you're able to make those monthly payments. Otherwise, your business is going to be costing you money rather than making you any money, or at least breaking even. Once you've learned your equipment and you're comfortable with everything that you have on hand, it's time to go public. So, publish all of those pages, those Facebook pages, your website. Register it as a business with Google, Bing, Yahoo, Yelp, all of those different services. If you register your business as a business listing on Google, you don't show up in the stack, you show up on the right-hand side of the screen. It makes you look more professional. It makes it easier for you to be found when people search for your services on Google. And it's just going to help your business all around. And the last thing, get reviews. I don't know about you, but when I see a business offering the services I'm looking for, they don't have any reviews, I'm probably going to skip by them because I trust other people's reviews. A lot of people are like that. So if you can, I know it's awkward, but if you've got a good relationship with your clients, ask them, would you be willing to leave me a review? It's going to help your business get noticed, it's going to boost your credibility, and it's going to increase the rate in which you pull in clients. And again, these are just a few of the check marks that you need to hit in your long-term goals. So if you want to be self-sufficient within a year, you have a lot of check boxes to hit before you can effectively do that. If you're not making the money monthly that you need to make in order to be self-sufficient on your business, then you've got to figure out a way to do so. Finding clients, changing your pricing, figuring out a way to advertise. All of these things are going to help you, and all of these things are things that you need to have as check boxes on your route to that 1 year, 2 year, 3 year goal. So, I know it's a pretty quick class, but we just wanted to dip our toes into setting a timeline so that you folks know the value and importance of setting an effective business timeline. Thank you, and that wraps it up for this week's business class. We'll see you entrepreneurs back here next week. All right, so as promised earlier, we have a fantastic interview planned with Lindsay Taylor-Jackson, who is an incredible cinematographer and filmmaker. I actually had the privilege of meeting her in college, and she's been off to LA and the East Coast and just all over the world doing incredible work. So we're going to start that interview with her. She's going to introduce herself, tell you folks a little bit about her story and how she got to where she is now. So without any further ado, Lindsay, welcome to Freelance Filmmaker.
Thank you so much. Thank you for speaking highly of me. It's really great to catch up with you again. I actually believe we first met each other freshman year, first semester in an acting class, which is hilarious to think about now because I absolutely hate to be in front of the camera. But it was a requirement, and it was a good time. I had fun sitting next to you.
That was an interesting class, and it's ironic that you say that because I'm on the other end of this phone here, sitting in front of a camera. So
yeah, see,
it pays off.
Prepping you.
Exactly. This is good. Serendipity.
That's so funny. So I am a filmmaker. My specialty is mostly in cinematography. I'm a DP, but a lot of the projects that I've done over the last few years have been independent. So it has been wearing multiple hats and taking on multiple positions on films to get to do the work that I've wanted to do the last few years.
Yes, the indie film world, the world of multiple hats and not a lot of sleep.
I know. How many hats are you and Gwen wearing these days?
Oh, goodness. Lighting, colorist, editing, DP, directing, producing.
That's so great.
All of the hats.
All of the hats, yeah.
So, yeah, I think our audience would really like to hear about what it is that first got you into film production or filmmaking. What was it that drew you in?
Yep. So I always, from a young age, have had a camera in my hands, even when I was in kindergarten. I remember when I was applying for college, I wrote my college essay about, in kindergarten, our art teacher came in and she had a Polaroid camera and I took a photo, and it was like in that moment I knew. I was 4 or 5 and I took a photo and I knew I love this so much. And from then on it was at family parties where I'd be running around asking if I could borrow people's cameras and take photos of everyone. And my family completely encouraged it for years. They'd find me at family parties and say, "Lindsay, here's my camera, go wild." They knew it.
Yeah.
They knew I loved it.
That's wonderful.
Yeah. And then in early high school, I took my first darkroom photography course. And I think I ended up, yeah.
Those are wonderful.
Yep. I think I ended up taking 11 photography courses in high school. I loved it so much. I spent all my free periods in the darkroom, and I went to pre-college courses at the Art Institute of Boston on my weekends and summers, and took classes there. Yeah. And growing up, I always had a really hard time learning. Like,
yeah.
Sorry.
So getting stuck behind a book and having trouble focusing on the book, or sitting down and writing a paper about something that you don't care about.
Yeah, I think I did well on assignments that were projects, that were visual based, and that's just completely how my brain works. When it comes to standardized testing, that's just not how my brain works whatsoever.
Is that how anybody's brain works? I don't know anybody who takes a standardized test and enjoys it. Like, yeah, sweet, SATs, I was looking forward to this.
But yeah, so it was a great outlet. It was a great way to learn in a different way and to exercise my brain in a different way. And so I always knew I wanted to go into imagery. And I was lucky that I found that early on because school was very challenging. And I worked really hard in school, but it was really, really 1,000 times harder than other people around me, it felt like. And so I knew I wanted to continue in images. And so I remember I was talking to my sister and I was saying, should I go into photojournalism or should I go into filmmaking? And I remember she said, well, Lindsay, you've already been photographing every single day since you were 14 or some age. and she said, some young age when I started darkroom photography. And she said, film is more of a specialty. You can continue photographing every single day while you're majoring in film. And so that kind of locked it for me, that I was thinking, okay, I want to go into the motion of images. And so I started looking around at schools, and I really didn't want to go to a city. I really wanted to be by the mountains because I'm someone who just likes being in nature and being able to think. And it's a place where I feel like I can breathe. And when I take those moments to breathe, I can come back out and have all the energy again to make the work I want to make.
Oh yeah, absolutely. There is no doubt some sort of connection between nature and the creative process. Gwyneth and I have noticed it ourselves. If we're in town too long, our creative process starts to stagnate, so we have to go. And in fact, we're going up to Steamboat in a couple of days just to kind of give ourselves a reboot. So there's something to be said for that.
I'm jealous. I'll probably catch a flight out to meet you guys.
You'll have to do it. You'll have to do it. It's a beautiful time of year. Hopefully we'll get the yellowing of the aspens.
Oh, that would be so nice. Awesome.
So you came to Keene State College, which, it doesn't get much more beautiful than that. And you started in the film production program. What was it about the film production program that you liked? And is it something that you think a filmmaker needs in order to succeed? Or is it something that a dedicated filmmaker can do on their own? Because I know we have a portion of our audience who may not have gone to school for this or may not have had the opportunity to go to school for this. And we've had a couple of people touch on it, but what's your opinion?
Yeah. So when I went to Keene State College, one thing that I really loved about it was the small class size. Yeah. Growing up and struggling in school and having these really big class sizes, I felt like I often got lost and didn't get the help or attention I needed academically. And so going to a small film school, I felt like, I really, really took advantage of my resources. I would go and I would talk to my professors in their office hours every single day. I would pick their brains. I would use my time to make extra projects and talk to professors. And so having more of that one-on-one constantly helped my learning so immensely. So that was one thing I really loved there. And even just a smaller community just felt really... It feels like in a smaller community, you can really take advantage of big opportunities if you make them for yourself. I think there's a bad association with going to a state college, but I think it's really what you make of it. I know a lot of kids that went to really amazing, great schools and, they messed around with their time and it doesn't really matter what school you have slapped on your resume if you didn't take advantage of the opportunity. And Keene State was a place that made it so easy to take advantage of everything that was offered there if you put in the effort and if you seeked out others who were willing to take on these big projects with you.
Yeah, absolutely. And the film program, it has two kinds of students. And tell me if you think or if you have a different opinion. But I found Keene State had two kinds of students, or I think colleges in general have two kinds of students when it comes to a liberal arts program like this. Those who are serious about it and those who are hoping for an easy A. And if you are serious about it, you rise to the top fairly quickly, and those doors and those opportunities just open up for you. And if you don't, then I mean, it's sure you may get a passing grade, but those aren't skills if you're not passionate about them that you're likely to be able to use in the real world. And what's your thought on that?
I agree with that, but obviously I don't know firsthand, but I also have a feeling that takes place everywhere, because I think deciding your life at 16, 17, kids going into school not understanding money exactly and how much education is in this country, don't fully understand or aren't ready for the opportunity, which is extremely unfortunate because they end up paying for it for a large portion of their lives. Yeah. But I think that was something when we were at school that I felt very heavily. I am hoping it is changing. I know I actually had a few Keene State students help on one of my film sets last year. And
oh, cool.
Yeah, and I was talking to them and we were talking about the differences, and it sounds like the program is getting stronger and kids are taking things more seriously, and that was just such a great thing to hear.
Yeah, that is very nice to hear, because Keene's got such a solid film program. It's the hidden gem of the Northeast.
Yeah, definitely, and that's the thing. Even to this day, I always am thinking, I cannot believe the professors we had. They were just so incredible. Yeah, it is a hidden gem, and I remember someone saying it's because they want to live in the Northeast because it's so beautiful, and so we were so privileged that we got these professors that we got.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and we've already had Lance on the show, but we're going to be having, hopefully, others. We're going to be reaching out, like Deb White Stanley. Hopefully, we can get her on one of these weeks, because she's just so knowledgeable on it, and her story is just so interesting and fascinating. So, yep. Lance is still constantly influencing my life. I mean, I'm in contact with him probably a couple of times a month, or every week even. And there's just something new going on, and I wouldn't have it any other way. So I hope it's the same with you.
Yeah, that's another great thing about going to a smaller school is you get these relationships with these professors where after school they become friendships, and it's really a beautiful thing in your career to have these trusted people who you can always turn to and talk to.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, what might you say to somebody who didn't have the opportunity to go to a film school? Because we've talked a lot about our experience and how wonderful it was. And I know there are folks out there who get discouraged, and I've told folks this before. When they think, oh, well, I wasn't able to go to school for it, I don't have the formal training, I feel like I'm just not up to par. What would you say to somebody like that? Is it something that is a make or break, or if they are passionate about it and serious about it, they can make it happen on their own?
Yeah, so I know people have multiple opinions, so I'm not in any way saying my opinion is the only correct one. But
Lindsay's laying down the law here.
I am someone who thinks the cost of school in America is absolutely ridiculous, and to go into the arts with that amount of money is, it seems counterintuitive, because if you're going into indie filmmaking, that's a struggle to match that money. And so I think it also depends on the personality of a person. I think if you're someone who can go and network and get on these sets and do a great job, then I think you absolutely don't need school. I think all of the resources are out there. You can go and read books. I mean, all this stuff is online now, right? So you can go and you can study this, and you don't have to get into this massive debt. It's really about self-disciplining. For me, I remember you were asking me today if I could potentially talk about a book or a movie that a film student should see or should read. And I was thinking about this, and my answer is, I think the most influential thing a filmmaker can do is to go out and to get life experience. I think that is what really comes across in your work. You can read as much text as you want to read. You can watch as many films as you want to read. Of course, those will help you and those will influence your education and your work. But to make you a well-rounded filmmaker, I think the greatest thing you could do is to go out and to get life experience. And I also think it'd be a great idea if people aren't really sure if they want to spend the money, if they want to go into film school, go out and get some experience in the film world. See where it's leading. See if you're, quote unquote, climbing the ladder. And if you're not, you can consider film school. But I think it's good to weigh your options. And I don't feel like at our age in this country, we were really, at least not at my school, I don't feel like I was really offered that option. And the other thing to consider is education in Europe is often incredibly more affordable. So I just think people should look into several different options before they decide on one. And maybe film school in America is the best choice for you. I mean, it's been great for me, but I genuinely feel like there are so many paths to take, and why not try them? Because you don't know where they'll lead, and if you have the personality and you have the drive, it's all about having the self-discipline and really making sure that you're learning everything you can, then who's to say school is the only way you can get there? I think there are multiple avenues that I was never really offered that I think people should look into.
So there you folks have it, right from the mouth of Lindsay Jackson. If you don't want to go to film school, watch Freelance Filmmaker and you'll learn everything you need to know. I'm kidding. Don't do that. Don't sue me, please. That was a joke. Disclaimers are important.
I should say I don't regret going to film school, but I just think people should look into options.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's great advice. And so you talked a little bit about opportunities that film school offered you. Tell us a little bit about how it is that you ended up in Prague.
Yeah, so actually when I was at Keene State, I remember I was walking by Lance and Kevin Sweet, who was his teaching assistant at the time, and I knew I wanted to study abroad. I had never been on a plane before. My family just never really traveled, or only traveled locally when we were growing up. So I'd never been on a plane before, and I remember walking by them one day. I think I was a sophomore, and I was like, hey, if I were to study abroad, where should I go? And they both just went, Prague, and walked away.
I can see them doing that.
No,
I can actually see that exchange.
Yeah, and so I went home later and, looked up all this info on Prague, and that week I think I went into the study abroad office and asked about it in the film school there, started looking into the film school there, and it's one of the oldest and best in the world. Wow. Started putting a portfolio together for, it's called FAMU, the Academy of Film and Performing Arts, and found out a few weeks later, I think, that I had gotten in for 2011. And I was so excited. My family was a little bit like, who are you? How are we related to you? And I still remember every single detail of my parents dropping me off at the airport and I just remember I was 20 years old. I got on the plane. I was really nervous because I'd never been on a plane before. I was looking around like, is this normal? Is this okay? And I just remember looking over, and across from me, there's like a toddler who flies all the time and was just like so happy and excited in their own world. And I was like, okay, they're happy, so this is good. So I ended up going to FAMU. I believe I took 14 courses in one semester. I was auditing extra courses because those professors are some of the best filmmakers in the world. And so, of course, I was stacking on extra courses, and I worked on 6 films in one semester. I was a cinematographer on my group's film, and it was amazing. It was highly academic. I had no free time. I didn't even really get to explore that much. And so I was 20 years old, and I made myself a promise. Okay, right now you can focus on the academics, but one day you will return here and you will explore this culture through a lens. And so eventually, a few years later, I saved up and I bought a one-way ticket to Prague, and my family was horrified. And I said, okay, I'm going to go make a film. And everyone was like, I don't know if that's going to happen. And so I flew abroad, and I found this story in this tiny Czech village, and I ended up moving out there by myself. It was an hour and a half outside of Prague, and I filmed I filmed it for about 3 years, and I was the exotic American in the village.
So everybody wanted to be in the film then.
Yeah, pretty much. So that film, I'll just launch into, that film is called Velvet Citizen. It's about a man who is now 80 years old, and he's been building a boat for the last 40 years by hand. So half of his life he's been building it. He's always had the dream of sailing around the world that he's been working towards, but he first began building the boat when former Czechoslovakia was still under the communist regime, so they weren't even allowed to travel to the oceans at that point. So he began this dream never knowing if it would even become realized in his life.
That's some pretty powerful faith right there.
Right? He inspires me every day.
That is. And for those of you watching, I will include a link in the show notes to Lindsay's website, which is it the full film or the trailer for Velvet Citizen?
Right now the website is the trailer for Velvet Citizen. And you can read all about the people on the team as well. Oh,
cool. Perfect. Again, for those of you watching, I will include a link in the show notes to Lindsay's website where you can see the trailer for Velvet Citizen, as well as read a little bit about the crew and their experience. So really, really good stuff. And you can check out some of her other film work. It's all fantastic, I promise. So moving on from Europe, you came back, and I know you've been really busy in the film world. I don't want to keep you here too much longer, but I did want you to tell us a little bit about getting accepted into the American Film Institute. So you go from this incredible institute in Prague to one of the best film institutes in the United States. So obviously you have exactly zero talent. What was that journey like? How did you first get started on the journey to the American Film Institute, and what was your experience there like?
Yeah, definitely. So I have always looked into AFI, the American Film Institute. And when I felt like a few years ago, I felt like I was at a crossroads of coming out of school, and I had saved up a bunch of money from work, and I was deciding, do I try to go to a film school now, plus taking on loans, or do I go to Europe and make a film with the money I've saved up? And so I'm someone who really believes that a choice isn't necessarily the right one. I think we're very adaptable as humans. I think we make choices and we figure out how to make it work. So, so who knows? I think either path, I could have made it work. Of course, if I had even gotten into AFI at that point, I was really young, so they might have said get more life experience. or they could have said no. um, so I ended up choosing going to Europe and making a film on my own because I wanted the life experience. I wanted to self-teach myself making a feature documentary on my own. And so I ended up going there. And I'm really glad that I did because I just felt like that was how I personally should have spent my early to mid-20s.
Mm-hmm.
And I did teach myself so much, and I worked so hard, and I learned so much, and I got a lot of life experience. So then a few months ago now, fast forward to now, a few months ago, the American Film Institute put out a article that they were launching their very first cinematography introductory intensive for women course. And this program, it was tuition free, which was sponsored by 21st Century Fox and was in partnership with the American Society of Cinematographers.
Oh,
I knew that, that's what I said when I read it. I knew that I absolutely wanted to apply to this because AFI as a cinematographer has obviously been on my radar for a very long time. And so I ended up going for the tuition-free workshop, and it was amazing. There were, I believe it was 19 women out of 750 applicants, and it was hands down one of the best experiences of my life. I learned so much. I networked so much. I met some really kick-ass ladies. Can I say that on your show?
Yes, you can say that on the show. We'll let it slide this one time. You get one strike.
I mean, there's no other way to sum up that group of women, honestly.
That's amazing.
Yeah, it was really incredible. And then we got an email a week or two later that was saying we were invited to come back for another free workshop. So I got on a plane within, I think, 3 hours and went to it because when AFI offers you a free workshop, you don't pass it up.
No. I'm sure that plane ticket wasn't free, though. 3 hours beforehand. Oh, my goodness.
Yeah, well, don't tell anyone except for everyone who's listening. But my friends got me on a standby flight, so.
Oh, good friend. Good friend.
Exactly. But yeah, it was just the best experience. And one thing, I'm really grateful for everyone who helped me get there, who gave me recommendations, for everyone who's ever helped on my projects, because on top of my letters of recommendation, it was submitting my work from my independent films. And the big piece of work that I submitted was from Velvet Citizen. And so that was just such a great feeling to know that I had chosen one path and I still in some capacity ended up, even if it was minuscule, ended up on the other path in a way.
Serendipity. Or fate. All right. Well, thank you for sharing that. That's an awesome journey. And honestly, I didn't know some of the details of that. So it was really cool hearing just how one thing led to another. And I know, so for those of you watching, you can see just through Lindsay's journey, just by going with the flow, putting the time and the effort in, and taking opportunities when they presented themselves, she was able to do some really, really incredible things around the world and back here at home. So Lindsay, I know you already touched on it with the what would you recommend to a filmmaker just starting out in the form of book or class, and you said real world experience. So then the other two questions, what are your 3 favorite films is the first.
Can I also add one thing quickly?
Oh, yeah.
Just in the earlier question of should people go to film school, so going off of that, I know a lot of people who didn't go to film school, majored in something completely different, and then, stumbled into film a little bit later in life, and they are highly, highly successful.
Yeah.
I think people just need to keep that in mind, that if you did make a career choice at 16 or 17, you don't necessarily have to be married to it for your whole life. I think it's great, and maybe it feels like a social taboo a little bit. I'm not sure, but I think it's great when people explore outside what their education was, because I think education in other areas and different subjects actually feeds so much into filmmaking. I think that's something that's incredibly valuable.
Yeah, 100%. Life experiences gives you something to actually put on film. It gives you emotion to tap into.
Exactly.
And actually, I found my two questions. They're kind of similar, but what's a resource or a resource or book that you recommend to somebody just starting out in the industry? The other one was, what piece of advice would you give to somebody just starting out in the industry? And you actually kind of nailed them both, two birds with one stone. So we'll move on to, what are your three favorite films?
My three favorite films. So I always struggle with this question. It is always evolving, and it very much depends on my mood or my inspiration of the week, I suppose.
Yeah.
So I am very 50-50 split on narrative and documentary work when it comes to cinematography. I love both equally. So I wrote down a list of movies, and I'm just going to say three. So the first one I think I always might have to say, because I saw this in high school, and it really was the first thing that made me consider moving from photography to cinematography, is The Graduate. Those images are just, those images captivated me. I was probably 17, I saw it, and maybe 16, 17, and I saw it, and I just remember every still feeling like, or every second feeling like a still photograph, and yet this was a motion piece. It was a film. So I remember that was the first time I was like, maybe I could go into motion. So I always owe it to The Graduate to say that, which I actually ended up making my senior thesis film when I was at Keene State, because I already watched it every week anyways. There's so many. One recently that has really been inspiring me, and this definitely relates to going to the American Film Institute for that workshop. Natasha Breyer came, she's part of the ASC and ADF, and she came and she presented to our workshop, and she presented her film Neon Demon, and the cinematography in it is just so insane. Like, I just find myself throughout the day randomly thinking of shots. It's so beautiful and insane. And I also have a deep experimental background in film. And so seeing this film and having her present and talk about it, I think was the first time, which is extremely powerful, is the first time that I really felt like, I can incorporate this experimental side of film into narrative cinematography. Because a lot of times people look down on experimental, but I think there is a way to tie them together.
I think the best director out there right now, at least from what I've seen, I haven't seen Neon Demon, but any of Tarsem's work, The Fall, The Cell, his use of experimental in those films is so interesting.
Awesome. Yeah, I agree. And then, oh my God, now I'm deciding between films. Did you take French by chance? Because I took 5 years of Spanish, and I will butcher this film name.
I did not take French, and I took 4 years of Spanish, so I'm in the same boat.
Oh no, our audience is screwed. Café de Flore. I don't know how to say it in French. I know it's a lot more beautiful than that.
Well,
We'll put it in the show notes, so regardless, they will be able to find it.
I know all the people who speak French out there are laughing at me right now. That's okay. But that film was made in 2011, I think, and I still watch it all the time. It's an insane story, but it's the imagery, the cinematography. I say insane story in a good way. It might not rub people the right way, but I love it. But the cinematography is just, it's so beautiful. And then I also always watch nature documentaries, and I always wish that David Attenborough could just narrate my daily life. That would be the dream life for me.
Ooh, all right. Well, we've got one in the David Attenborough box now, because most of them are in the Morgan Freeman box right now.
He can come. That's fine.
We'll featured guest.
Yes. Awesome.
That wraps it up for today's interview. Lindsay, thank you so much for coming onto the show and sharing your journey with the Freelance Filmmaker Nation here, or the Freelance Filmmaker Nerds. I haven't decided yet. We're working on that. So we'll put a poll out. We'll let you guys vote on what you want to be called. But Lindsay, thank you so much again for coming on to the show. It's been an absolute pleasure, and it was great catching up too.
Yeah, it's really great to hear from you, and I'm excited to keep exchanging what we learn and do in film with each other. And thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate it so much.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you again, and we'll talk again soon.
So for this week's review, we're going to talk about the Sony FE 24-70mm f-stop 2.8 GM lens. That is a mouthful. Though this lens comes at a very hefty price of a whopping $2,200, which is basically an arm and a leg, we are very pleased with the awesomeness of this lens. When deciding on a new lens to purchase, understanding your necessary focal length is imperative. For example, if you're a sports photographer and you're stuck on the sidelines, but you want that close-up clear shot of your subject, you're going to need a much longer focal length, such as a telephoto lens. But if you're a landscape photographer, you're going to want a much shorter focal length so you can get that whole field of view. Alright, back to the Sony 24-70mm. One of the best parts of this lens is that it covers a very nice range of focal lengths, which makes it a very versatile lens that you can use in many different situations. We have shot photographs using this lens that vary from wedding photographs, portrait photographs, action photography, landscapes, the list goes on. This has made it an essential part of our lens kit. At 24mm, this lens has very little distortion, which is very unique to wide-angle lenses. The slight distortion that it does have is easily fixable in Lightroom or Photoshop. Another truly awesome feature of this lens is that it goes down to an aperture of 2.8, which is extremely unique for zoom lenses. This has allowed us to take very dynamic and atmospheric shots in a number of scenarios. As we've discussed in our classes, being able to keep our aperture at 2.8 allows us to also keep our ISO down, which makes this lens perfect in low light. As far as image quality and focus speed, this lens has performed beautifully. Even at a wide open aperture of 2.8, the image still remains crisp and clear. As far as focus speed goes, we haven't noticed any issues even when we've used it for action photography. So in conclusion, yes, the price tag is truly terrible in comparison to Canon or Nikon. As far as E-mounts go, all the alternatives pale in comparison to the quality of this lens. I mean, it would be nice to have our arms and legs back, but we have been very happy with the purchase of this lens. So that's it, guys. That's the review for the Sony FE 24-70mm f-stop 2.8 GM lens.
All right, for this week's resource recommendation, we got a really special one for you, one that's really close to my heart. And it's not so much of a resource as it is a mindset. Starting your business and not getting clients for the first couple of weeks or couple of months, it is wildly disheartening. We know, we've been there. The power of positivity is a real thing. And appreciate your failures, because you're gonna fail, and you're gonna fail a lot. That's okay. We still do on a regular daily basis. But it doesn't hurt to have a little bit of extra motivation. And so this week, I'm recommending to you Eric Thomas in every form that that gentleman comes in. Whether it be podcast, whether it be his book. The dude knows how to keep you motivated, get you going every morning, and pushing through your daily struggles, because we've all been there, we're all going through it. And I'll tell you what, this guy gets me so motivated that I listen to him when I'm at the gym. So, Eric Thomas, check out his book, check out his podcast, check out his website, check out his motivational speeches. He'll give you that little extra oomph that you need to make it through the day. So that wraps it up for this week's resource recommendation. And that actually wraps it up for this week's episode. So we will see you back here next week for an exciting episode of Freelance Filmmaker.